They gave her no name, just a number scratched on the corner of a ledger and a broom taller than she was. The boarding house took her in after the fire swept through the mill town, not because they were kind, but because they needed small hands for tight spaces and cheap labor to scrub the floors before dawn. She slept beside the stove on a piece of burlap that smelled of coal and grease. The cook called her Thing, and the name stuck like soot in winter. It was January when the girl lost her voice, not from illness, but from something quieter and more permanent. No one noticed. Her chores doubled, then tripled, as older children were sold off or run away. By 13, she moved like a shadow between the barn and the main house, her steps so light she barely disturbed the dust she cleaned. When men passed, they barely saw her. When women passed, they turned their heads, guilt buried beneath bonnets and busy hands. That morning, the storm came. It wasn't rain or wind, but a man. He wore dust on his shoulders like an old friend, grey around the edges, with boots so worn they whispered on the wood. He came to trade a colt for feed. The girl was scrubbing the porch with a frayed rag, knees raw and red. She didn't look up when his shadow fell across her hands. He didn't speak either, just watched. Not with pity, not with the hunger of men who looked too long, but something quieter. Recognition. Inside, voices argued. The foreman didn't want the colt, said they had no time for horses that weren't broken. The man left without raising his voice, but he lingered at the edge of the fence, eyes fixed on the girl as she hauled the bucket to the trough. Her coat was too thin, her fingers cracked and blue. Still, she didn't flinch, didn't cry. That night, the wind moaned like a wounded dog. The girl wrapped herself tighter in the burlap sack, listening to the rafters creak. She didn't dream anymore, not since Miss Lorna died, and no one came to claim her. The world was cold and flat. But just before dawn, the kitchen door opened. Quiet steps. A shadow crossed the floor and paused beside her. He knelt, placed something by her side, a wool scarf, thick and smelling of pine smoke. She stared at it for a long time before touching it. When she looked up, the man was gone. And for the first time in years, she felt something stir like a match striking somewhere deep inside. Not hope, not yet, but a memory of what it once felt like. The scarf stayed hidden beneath her coat for days. She dared not wear it outright, afraid it might be taken, or worse, that someone would ask where it came from. But in the silence of the barn, when the frost bit hardest and her breath rose like ghost smoke, she pressed it to her face. It smelled of wood smoke and saddle oil. It smelled like a place that didn't exist for her, not yet. At the boarding house, the girls avoided her, not out of cruelty, but because misfortune clung to her like burrs. She was the one who didn't cry when beaten, who didn't speak when insulted, who never got letters. Even the cook stopped calling her Thing. She simply became a presence, nameless, voiceless, not quite girl, not quite gone. Then the man returned. No one expected it. He came with another trade, a crate of seed potatoes and a pair of lambskins. He spoke little, gave fewer smiles. But when his eyes found her again by the woodpile, splitting kindling with an axe too dull, something passed between them. A quiet understanding, a recognition of old wounds. The foreman asked if he needed help loading the crates. The man shook his head. "Got enough hands," he said. And with that he pointed not at a worker, not at a boy, but at her. The foreman scoffed. "She don't speak, don't even know if she hears proper." The man didn't blink. "She'll learn." They called it a trade, though no coin passed hands. The girl didn't resist when he lifted her onto the wagon. She didn't ask where they were going. She only clutched the scarf in her coat pocket, eyes wide and dry, and looked back at the building that had held her for years. No one waved. No one called her name. She didn't know it then, but she would never return. They traveled west, the wagon wheels groaning under the weight of seed and silence. He didn't ask her anything. She didn't offer. They stopped once for bread and jerky, and again by a frozen creek where he let the horses drink. She stood beside the wagon, unsure if she was meant to follow. He handed her a canteen, not with a smile, but with the plain decency of a man who understood thirst. That night they camped by a dead cottonwood. He built a fire with practiced hands, then laid out a blanket by the flames. She sat with her knees to her chest, the wool scarf wrapped around her neck now, visible. "You got a name?" he asked, without looking at her. She shook her head once. He poked the fire. "All right," he said. "We'll figure one out when you're ready." She watched the flames dance, the cold still gnawing at her bones, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. They reached his land just after the first thaw, when the snow melted into thick mud and the hills showed patches of stubborn grass. His ranch was modest, 2 barns, a corral, and a small house whose porch leaned slightly to one side. No one came to greet them. No dog barked. The silence hung heavy, but it was not cruel. It was the kind that spoke of grief too old for words. He showed her the room beside the kitchen. It had a cot, a stove, and a window facing east. The linens smelled of cedar. She didn't speak, just nodded once. When he turned to leave, she took the scarf from her coat and laid it on the bed, folding it with care. It was the first thing she placed down that truly felt hers. Days passed in quiet rhythm. He didn't ask much of her at first, just to feed the hens, sweep the porch, help water the mules. She moved carefully, watching him for cues, mimicking his pace. He rarely spoke, but never raised his voice. His silence was different from the silence of the boarding house. It didn't punish, it waited. Sometimes she caught him looking at the hills beyond the barn, a far-off sadness in his eyes. Once, in the evening light, she found him sitting by a small wooden cross at the edge of the pasture. Her footsteps stopped short. He didn't move, didn't speak. But when she left a tin cup of warm milk on the porch that night, he found it, drank it, and placed it back with a quiet nod come morning. They learned each other through small things. He began leaving apples in her coat pocket when the day was cold. She started lining his boots by the door each evening, brushed clean of dirt. He mended her coat without saying a word. She folded his shirts with care after washing them by the creek. She still had no name. He still had no family. One evening, as the wind blew in off the plains, he handed her a brush and pointed to the mule. "He's stubborn," he said, "but he'll let you close if you're patient." She took the brush in both hands and approached the animal slowly. The mule snorted once, but didn't shy. She ran the bristles down its flank, gentle, steady strokes. He watched her, arms crossed, nodding once when the mule leaned into her touch. "You got away," he murmured. She glanced back at him. His face was worn, sun-touched and lined, but something in it was soft, something almost kind. That night, as the fire crackled and the walls creaked with the wind, she sat near the stove with her knees drawn in. She looked around the small room, at the cot, the folded scarf, the scent of ash and wool. She belonged nowhere, had come from nothing, but something in the way the man moved around her, in the steadiness of his presence, told her she might be allowed to stay, not as a laborer, not as a ghost, but as someone who was beginning to be seen. Spring brought green to the hills, soft and tentative, like forgiveness taking root. The land exhaled, slow and damp, and with it, something loosened inside her too. She rose earlier now, not from fear, but from habit shaped by quiet purpose. He had given her no orders, only space. In that space, she began to exist. She learned to milk the goat, though it kicked once and knocked the pail over. She apologized aloud before remembering she hadn't spoken in weeks. The sound startled her, small and rasped like wind through dry grass. He looked up from where he was splitting fence rails, but said nothing, only nodded again, slow and steady. They began eating together, not because he asked her to, but because she started setting 2 plates instead of 1. Meals were sparse beans, bread, sometimes rabbit, but eaten without hurry. He never bowed his head to pray, only closed his eyes a moment before lifting his fork. She copied the gesture, unsure if it was prayer or memory. One morning, the fog rolled in thick as cream. The corral posts vanished into it, and the rooster crowed blindly into the grey. She stepped outside, boots sinking into wet earth, and paused. He was already there, coiling rope by the barn door. He saw her and pointed to the fence. "Fog like this," he said, "makes a mule forget where home is." They walked the line together, her hand resting now and then on the rails, as if to be sure the world hadn't vanished. The cold kissed her face, but inside her coat, warmth bloomed. Not from the scarf or the fire waiting back at the house, but from this. From walking beside someone who expected nothing, yet welcomed all. Later that week, she found a small wooden box on her cot. Inside were buttons, thread, and 3 hair ribbons, faded but clean. She ran her fingers over them, careful as if touching something holy. She had no hairbrush, no mirror, but that night she tied one ribbon around her wrist and slept with her hand beneath her cheek. He started calling her kid, not the way men used it in town, gruff and careless, but with something softer around the edges, like it was a placeholder for a name still growing. She didn't mind. In truth, it felt like a secret stitched between them. One late afternoon, as thunderheads stacked on the horizon, she saw him at the edge of the paddock holding a small tin box. He didn't open it, just stood there, head bowed, thumb moving over the lid. When he noticed her watching, he gave the faintest shake of his head and turned back toward the barn. She didn't follow, but that night she placed her own ribbon, untied now, on the windowsill beside his tin cup. A silent gesture. Not intrusion, just presence. Their house held few words, but many exchanges. The steady rhythm of footsteps on the porch, the scrape of firewood in the stove, the whistle he used when calling the mule, her humming barely audible as she swept the floor in the soft light of evening. She had been taken in without contract, without condition. No promise had been made aloud. Yet she knew. This ranch, these hills, this man with his quiet grief was the closest thing she had ever known to a beginning. Summer crept in without fanfare, just heat settling in the bones of the earth. Dust rose with each footfall, fine as flour, and the air held the hush of long days. She was taller now, or maybe just steadier. Her steps no longer sought to disappear. She moved with intent, watering the rows of beans before sunrise, checking the fence lines with a practiced eye. They didn't speak of what they were. He still called her kid, and she still answered with a glance or a quiet nod. But something unspoken had taken root between them, like a tree growing underground, silent but firm. Then came the letter. It arrived in the hand of a deputy from town, stiff in his boots and looking like he didn't want to be the one to carry bad news. He handed it over without meeting the rancher's eyes, then tipped his hat to the girl and left with dust trailing behind him. The man stood on the porch for a long time, letter unopened. She watched from the barn door, sensing something shift in the wind. When he finally read it, his shoulders tensed, jaw set like stone. That night, he drank 2 fingers of whiskey, slow and bitter, and didn't say a word at supper. The next day, he told her. "They're coming," he said, eyes fixed on the hills. "Family says you were never meant to leave. Say you were stolen." She stood still, heart thudding like a loose hinge. The sun was high, baking the yard, but she felt cold inside. "Do they know I don't belong to them?" she asked, her voice thin from disuse. He looked at her then, really looked. "They don't care. It's about name and blood. They want what looks proper." She sat on the porch step, arms around her knees. He didn't try to comfort her, just sat beside her, boots planted firm in the dust. "They got papers," he said. "Sheriff might listen." She nodded once. It wasn't new, the idea of being taken, of being claimed by those who saw her only as a burden or proof of something they lost. But this place, this man, was different. She didn't want to vanish again. A week passed. The sun turned harsher, and the wind carried whispers from town. Folks remembered things they'd rather forget, that she had no birth record, that he'd never fathered a child, that quiet things were sometimes dangerous. The deputy came back, not alone this time. With him was a woman dressed in black silk and lace, eyes sharp as dry twigs. She said the girl's real name was Liza and that she was owed a return to her people. The girl didn't answer, just stood behind the rancher, chin lifted. "She don't belong here," the woman said. He looked at the girl. "She belongs where she's safe." "And what are you?" the woman snapped. "A broken man with no family, playing house with someone else's mistake?" He didn't flinch. Then the girl stepped forward. "I may not have a name that suits your paper," she said, voice steady, low, "but I have a place, and I'd rather sweep barns than sit pretty in a house where no one sees me." The woman's lip curled. "That isn't your choice." But the rancher stepped in front of her, voice firm. "It is now." They left with threats, promises of court and shame. But he didn't look away, and she didn't retreat. That night, she sat at the edge of the pasture, looking out at the stars. He came and stood beside her, silent as always. "They might come back," she whispered. "I know, and if they do..." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, calloused and warm. "Then I stand in front of you again." She didn't cry, just leaned into the quiet space between them and felt for the first time not claimed, but chosen. The letter from the county arrived 2 weeks later, pressed with the seal of authority, folded like it carried the weight of God. It summoned him to town for questioning, under suspicion of unlawful custody. The girl stood in the doorway when he read it. He didn't speak, just folded the page slowly and set it beside his coffee cup. She'd grown used to silence, but that day it felt different, like the hush before a thunderstorm when even the grass holds its breath. He hitched the wagon at dawn the next morning. She brought him a clean shirt, the one with the mended collar she'd sewn in the half-light of their evenings. He didn't say thank you, but he wore it. At the gate, she handed him the scarf, the same one he'd given her that first night, now worn soft by years of quiet belonging. "Take this," she said, "in case you forget where home is." He took it, folding it once, then tucking it in his coat. "I won't." She watched him ride away, dust lifting behind the wheels like old ghosts. Then she went inside, boiled water and waited. The hearing was public. They called him reckless. They questioned his judgment, his masculinity, his right to call anything family. The woman in black testified with polished grief, speaking of bloodlines, of inheritance, of shame. The girl wasn't present, but the room felt full of her absence. Then they asked him to speak. He stood slowly, hat in hand. The courtroom stilled. "She didn't ask to be mine," he began, "and I never asked for a daughter, but the world placed her at my gate and I didn't turn her away." He paused, voice worn, eyes steady. "She don't speak much, doesn't cry either, but she's braver than any soul I've known. Picks her own switch for the fence, brushes the mule with care, and hums when she thinks I ain't listening. I've seen her smile twice, once when the goat kidded, and once when I called her family." The judge looked down, hands clasped. "She belongs with you?" the lawyer asked. He nodded. "She belongs to herself, but if she'll have me, then yes, she belongs with me." They didn't decide that day. Sent word they'd deliberate, weigh papers against hearts. He rode home before the sun had set, face unreadable. She was waiting on the porch. He handed her the scarf. "They listened," he said, not sure what they heard. She stepped down, stood in front of him. The wind picked up then, slow and warm, carrying the scent of sage and dust. "You're not just someone who took me in," she said, voice low. "You're the only one who saw me." He looked at her, and in his eyes, worn, scarred, yet wide with something almost like awe, she saw herself reflected for the first time. "I ain't good with names," he said. She smiled, a small thing, fragile but real. "Then don't give me one. Just call me yours." In that moment, neither of them needed a law to name what had already been built in silence. The court's decision came folded in a pale blue envelope, sealed without ceremony. He didn't open it right away, just set it on the mantel beside the tin box that held the past and watched the fire settle into embers. She didn't ask. Didn't need to. By then, the ranch had changed. not in shape or size, but in breath. The porch no longer echoed hollow at dusk. The stove burned warmer. The barn, swept daily, smelled of hay and clean work. Even the mule had softened, nudging her elbow as she brushed its flank each morning. They moved like two notes in the same song. She'd begun humming more often now, quiet and tuneless, like the sound of belonging. He listened without letting on. Sometimes she'd catch him in the doorway, arms folded, eyes resting on her as if grounding himself in the fact she was still there. The day she called him Pa, it wasn't planned. She'd cut her hand while fixing the gate and came into the house with blood on her palm. He moved quick, quieter than usual, and cleaned the wound with steady hands. It stung, and she winced. "You all right, kid?" She nodded. "It's not deep, Pa." The word just fell out, soft as a breath. He paused, the cloth still pressed to her skin. Then only then he smiled. Not wide, just enough to make the lines around his eyes ease. He didn't speak. But when she went to bed that night, she found the tin box on her cot open. Inside was a photograph, faded, creased, a woman with dark eyes and a baby in her lap. Written on the back, in pencil worn thin, "Clara, 6 months." The next morning, she asked him about it. "She was mine," he said, "gone now. Long time gone, and the baby." He shook his head. She passed before her first step. She held the photo close to her chest. "Do you want me to carry her name?" she asked. He looked at her a long time. "No," he said softly, "I want you to carry your own." The decision from the court came and went. They ruled in his favor, not from sentiment, but lack of clear claim. No one came back. No more deputies. No more threats. She stayed. One morning near autumn's edge, she helped hang linens in the wind. He stood by the fence, squinting toward the hills. When she joined him, he placed a small wooden tag in her hand. Burned into it, rough but careful, were 3 letters. May. "It's short," he said. "But it's yours." She didn't cry, just turned it over in her palm again and again, like something precious. Later that evening, she nailed it above the barn door, just 3 small letters, but they filled the sky. Winter returned softer that year. Snow came slow, folding over the land like an old quilt. The hills hushed, and the sky hung low, pale with stillness. Inside the house, the stove crackled, and May sat by the window, stitching the hem of a worn blanket while steam curled from the pot. He was out by the fence, boots crunching lightly in the frost. She watched him from behind the glass, saw how the cold didn't make him small like it used to. He walked upright now, as if time had stopped leaning so heavy on his shoulders. When he came in, cheeks red, he placed a bundle on the table, dried apples, pine nuts, 2 strips of jerky wrapped in cloth. "Figured we'd ride out to the ridge tomorrow," he said. "Snow's light. Might still catch the creek running." She looked up, a smile forming before she realized it. "You ever think you'd raise a girl this far out?" He sat, slow, joints cracking like old branches. "Didn't think I'd raise anyone. And now?" He reached for the tin box on the mantel, opened it. Inside, beside the photograph, lay a lock of hair, a baby shoe, and the ribbon she once tied around her wrist. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The gesture was enough. Later that night, she found a book in the old chest blank pages, leather cover. She'd never learned to write well, but she'd watched him sign his name, rough and upright like fence posts. She dipped a pen in ink and wrote the first word across the first page. Home. The next morning, they rode out early, the colt she named Hope, stepping light through the frost. At the ridge, they sat without speaking, watching the creek shimmer in the morning light, half frozen but still moving. He took a deep breath. "You remember that scarf?" She nodded. "I kept it that whole week when they tried to take you. Sometimes I'd hold it at night, just to remind myself you were real." She didn't answer, just reached over and placed her gloved hand over his. The sun rose slow behind the hills, painting the snow in honey and gold. Birds called from somewhere unseen. The wind was still, their breath visible in the air between them. Since that morning, the ranch never echoed with silence again.